There are nights in the Montana mountains when the world stops pretending to be safe. Nights when the wind comes off the high ridges with a sound like something tearing, when the temperature drops so fast that the trees crack and groan under the weight of the ice forming along their branches, and when the road, if you can still call it a road, disappears under 2 feet of fresh snow that the storm keeps adding to, minute by minute, as though the mountain itself is trying to seal everything beneath it away from the living world above. This was one of those nights. The storm had come in faster than the forecast had predicted, which was not unusual in this part of Montana in January, where the weather systems rolled off the Rockies with the kind of contempt for human planning that only truly wild places ever manage. By 10 o'clock in the evening, the visibility on the logging roads north of Millhaven County had dropped to nearly zero, and any sensible person within 50 kilometers of those roads had long since found shelter, locked their doors, and accepted that the mountain had taken the night for itself. Jack Turner was not, by the assessment of most people who knew him, a sensible person. He was, however, a precise one. At 39 years old, with 12 years of Navy SEAL operations behind him and 18 months of Montana wilderness living ahead of him, he had developed a relationship with danger that was less about avoidance and more about calibration. He did not drive through blizzards because he was reckless. He drove through blizzards because he had trained himself to understand exactly what his body and his vehicle and his environment could and could not withstand, and on this particular night, the calibration had told him that the drive from the supply store in Millhaven back to his cabin in the high forest was manageable, barely, but manageable, if he kept his speed low, his attention high, and his headlights burning at full beam through the white. He had made this drive in worse conditions. Once in near-zero visibility with a broken windshield in 12 degrees below. He had made it then. He would make it tonight. Atlas sat in the passenger seat with the upright, attentive posture of a dog who understood, with some deep animal intelligence, that this was not the kind of night to relax. Atlas was 5 years old, a male German shepherd of extraordinary physical quality and deeper behavioral intelligence, a dog who had served alongside Jack through 2 of his final deployments before being retired from active service at the same time as his handler, both of them coming home carrying things that were not visible to the naked eye but that were present nonetheless, shaping every quiet hour and every sudden loud sound and every night when the darkness in the cabin felt a little too much like the darkness in other places. Atlas had adapted to Montana the way he adapted to everything, completely, efficiently, and with a philosophical acceptance of present reality that Jack had sometimes envied and always admired. The dog watched the storm through the windshield with calm amber eyes, his breathing slow and measured, his ears rotating occasionally toward sounds that Jack's human hearing could not yet distinguish from the wind. The road north of Millhaven's commercial center wound up through 2,000 feet of elevation gain before it reached the series of logging trails that connected to the private access roads serving the handful of properties scattered through the high forest. Jack had been on this road hundreds of times. He knew every curve, every dip, every section where the road narrowed between the trees to a width that barely accommodated his truck. He knew where the frost came first in autumn and where it held longest in spring. He knew where the deer crossed at dusk and where the elk bedded down in winter and where, 3 months ago, he had found a section of road washed out by an early storm that the county hadn't repaired yet. He drove with the intimate familiarity of a man who had mapped his territory not from a screen but from years of physical presence, in all weather, at all hours. And so when Atlas went stiff in the passenger seat, head forward, ears rigid, a soft sound rising from his chest that was not quite a growl but was unmistakably a signal, Jack did not dismiss it or explain it away. He reduced his speed to a crawl and leaned forward over the wheel. The headlights cut through the falling snow in 2 broad cones of white light that illuminated perhaps 20 meters of road ahead before the storm swallowed everything beyond. Jack swept his gaze slowly across that 20 meters, left side, road surface, right side, and then stopped. Something was in the road. Not to the side of it. In it. Standing directly in the center of the lane, facing the truck, caught in the headlights with a quality of arrested motion that suggested it had been moving and then stopped when it saw the light. A dog. Large, German shepherd body type, similar in build to Atlas but female, Jack could see at this distance, with a coat that was pale gray and white beneath the thick layer of snow and ice that had accumulated on her fur. She was standing in the road and she was not moving. But she was not standing well. Her left rear leg was held slightly off the ground, the weight transferred to the other three, and even at this distance, through the falling snow, Jack could see the hitched and painful quality of her posture. She was injured. She had been in this storm long enough to be coated in ice. And she was standing in the center of the road, looking directly at his headlights, and not moving. Jack stopped the truck. He watched her. She watched the truck. For a count of 5 seconds, nothing moved except the snow falling between them. Then the dog did something that Jack registered with immediate professional attention. She turned. She took 3 limping steps away from the truck, back in the direction she had apparently come from, then turned around and looked back at the headlights again. Then she barked. Once, twice, loud and urgent and deliberate, the kind of bark that carried intention rather than fear. Then she turned and took 3 more steps in the same direction and looked back again. Jack Turner had seen this behavior exactly once before in his life, and that had been Atlas, on a training exercise in the Cascade Mountains, indicating the position of a missing hiker. The memory arrived in his mind with the clarity of something important. He looked at Atlas. Atlas was already pressing against the door. What Jack Turner did not know yet, what he could not possibly have known in that moment, sitting in his warm truck on a frozen mountain road with a blizzard erasing the world around him, was that the dog standing in his headlights had been in that storm for 3 hours. That she had walked, on an injured leg, in temperatures that had dropped to -14 degrees, through drifts of snow that had reached her chest in places, circling the same spot over and over, refusing to leave. That she had done this not because anyone trained her to. Not because anyone told her to. But because there was someone in that snow, and she had decided, with the simple and absolute conviction that only the most loyal creatures are capable of, that she was not going to let the mountain have them. Jack cut the engine. He opened the door into the full force of the blizzard, and the cold hit him like a wall, not the gradual cold of a cool evening but the immediate, total cold of a serious winter storm, the kind of cold that gets into your lungs on the first breath and reminds you, very clearly, that this environment does not negotiate. He pulled up his collar, switched on his heavy-duty field flashlight, and stepped out onto the frozen road. Atlas came out behind him, landing in the snow with silent precision, and moved to Jack's left side without being told, his working position, muscle memory from hundreds of operations, as reliable as gravity. The injured dog in the road watched them approach. She did not retreat. She did not growl. She held her ground with a focused, waiting quality, her breath fogging in rapid pulses in the cold air, her left rear leg held carefully off the ground. When Jack was 10 meters away, she turned again and began moving through the snow to the right side of the road, into the tree line, limping with painful determination, glancing back every few steps. Jack followed. Before we go any further into this story, because what comes next is extraordinary, we want to take a moment right here to ask you something. Where are you watching or listening from right now? Drop your city, your country, your corner of the world in the comments below. And if stories like this one speak to you, stories about loyalty, about courage, about the moments that change everything, then please consider subscribing. We tell stories that matter, and every single subscriber makes it possible to keep telling them. Now come back with us, to a Montana forest at -14 degrees, where a limping dog is leading a Navy SEAL through a blizzard towards something buried in the snow. She led him 30 meters into the trees, off the road, into the deeper darkness where the pines closed overhead and the snow was both deeper on the ground and thinner in the air, sheltered somewhat from the worst of the wind. The flashlight carved through the dark, illuminating the dog's tracks, irregular, 3-footed, circling, and then the spot she was leading him to. A depression in the snow. Not a natural depression, not the hollow left by a fallen branch or a rock outcropping or an animal's sleeping place. This was a shape that Jack's trained eye recognized before his conscious mind had finished forming the thought. A human shape. The snow had drifted and settled over it, but beneath the drift, the form of a person was visible, the curve of a shoulder, the outline of a torso, one arm extended at an angle that suggested collapse rather than deliberate positioning. Jack was already on his knees before the thought completed itself, his gloves off, his hands moving through the snow with rapid, controlled urgency. He found her face first. Cleared the snow from it with careful sweeping motions, the way you clear debris from an IED, precisely, without panic, without hesitation. A young woman, mid-20s to early 30s, dark hair matted with ice and snow, skin pale beyond pale, lips beginning to shade toward the blue that meant the body was prioritizing its core temperature at the expense of everything peripheral. She was breathing. He checked that first, a check so automatic it happened before he was fully conscious of performing it, pressing 2 fingers to the side of her neck and finding the pulse weak and slow but present, the thread-like but determined heartbeat of a person whose body had decided it was not done yet. He checked her airway. Cleared. He checked for obvious injury. She had a gash on her temple, frozen over, the blood in her hair crystallized into dark ice. She had been unconscious for some time. He didn't know how long. But the dog, this gray and white stranger who had come to his truck through a blizzard on a broken leg, had known. Had stayed. Had refused to let the forest close over this moment. Jack lifted her with the ease of a man trained to carry weight in difficult terrain, 220 pounds of muscle and field experience making short work of the physics, and held her against his chest, using his body heat as an immediate resource while he moved back through the trees toward the truck. The injured dog limped beside him the entire way, never more than a step from the woman in his arms. Atlas cleared the path ahead, moving through the deep snow with powerful efficiency, his body checking the darkness on both sides with the automatic vigilance of a trained working dog who understood that this was not a routine moment. They reached the truck in 3 minutes. Jack got the back door open, laid the woman carefully across the back seat, pulled the emergency thermal blanket from the storage box behind the seat and wrapped it around her, then turned back to the injured dog. The dog was standing in the snow beside the truck, looking up at him. She had blood on her left rear leg, dark against the pale fur, frozen in a line that traced a wound Jack now saw clearly for the first time, a deep laceration running along the lower leg that had been there long enough to ice over at the edges. She needed warmth and treatment and rest. She also, clearly, needed to be near the woman on the back seat. Jack made the decision in approximately 1 second. He lifted the injured dog, gently, supporting the bad leg, and placed her on the back seat beside the unconscious woman. The dog circled once, then settled with her head across the woman's hip and her eyes on the door, every line of her body radiating the same intention that had driven her through 3 hours of storm. She was not done protecting. She was simply doing it somewhere warmer now. Jack climbed into the driver's seat and turned on the engine. He cranked the heat to maximum. He looked at the woman in his rearview mirror, still unconscious, breathing, the color in her face barely changed by the warmth yet. He looked at the injured dog, eyes open, watchful, steady. He looked at Atlas, who had taken his passenger seat position and was watching the back seat with focused attention. Then Jack noticed something that changed the nature of everything he had just done. Something on the unconscious woman's wrist, just visible above the thermal blanket's edge. A bracelet, not jewelry. A device. Hard black plastic, about the width of 2 fingers, fastened around her wrist with a tamper-resistant clasp. A GPS tracking bracelet. The kind used in law enforcement for monitored individuals. The kind that told someone, somewhere, exactly where its wearer was at every moment of every day. And the small green indicator light on its face was glowing steadily in the dark of the back seat, which meant the battery was good and the signal was active and whoever was receiving that signal knew, to within 20 meters, that this woman was in this truck, on this road, in this storm, right now. Jack looked at the bracelet for a long moment. Then he looked at the forest around the truck, visible in pale outline through the snow-covered windows. Then he put the truck in gear and drove. Not toward the main road. Away from it. He took the first forest access trail that cut east through the trees, a narrow path that appeared on no map but that he had driven dozens of times, that wound through the high forest toward his cabin by a route that added 40 minutes to the journey but that put 3 ridgelines between his destination and anyone watching the main road. He drove without headlights for the first kilometer, navigating by memory and the weak ambient light of the storm, using the same low-visibility driving skills he had developed in places where headlights were a target rather than a convenience. He needed time to think. And he needed that time to start before anyone tracking the bracelet signal had a chance to triangulate his heading. The woman's eyes opened 22 minutes into the drive. Not gradually, not the slow surfacing of normal sleep, but all at once, with a sharp intake of breath and a sudden stiffening of her whole body that Jack had seen before in people coming back from the edge. She sat up fast, or tried to, the thermal blanket and the dog lying across her hip limited the movement, and her eyes went immediately to the windows, scanning, assessing, the instinct of someone who had learned to assess environments before they had finished waking up in them. Jack watched her in the rearview mirror. He kept his voice even, unhurried, the tone he had learned to use in the field when the person across from him needed calm more than information. "You're in a truck," he said. "You're warm. You're safe. The dog is with you." She looked at the dog. Something in her face, some wire-tight tension that had been there from the moment her eyes opened, released slightly at the sight of the gray and white head across her lap. She pressed her hand against the dog's side, and the dog pressed back without lifting her head, without breaking her surveillance of the door. Her name was Anna Reyes. Jack would learn in the minutes that followed. She gave it willingly, in a voice still rough from the cold, as though giving her name was the minimum of trust she could offer, and she had decided that minimum was warranted. She was 31 years old. She had been on that road in the storm because she had needed to be somewhere that no road and no map could easily account for. She had been walking for 4 hours before the cold took her. She had fallen, not from the cold alone, but from exhaustion and an injury of her own, a sprained ankle from a stumble in the dark that had slowed her to a pace the temperature had eventually caught up to. The dog had found her when she went down, appeared out of the forest like something summoned, and had not left. Had curled against her side, sharing body heat, refusing to be moved by the wind or the snow or the passage of time. Anna had tried, in the last conscious moment she could remember, to push the dog away, not because she didn't want the warmth but because she knew, with the fatalistic clarity of someone approaching hypothermic unconsciousness, that the dog was too injured to survive a night in the open and she did not want something living to die in place of her. The dog had pressed closer anyway. Had stayed. Had apparently decided at some point that sitting with an unconscious woman in a Montana blizzard was insufficient and gone to find better options. Jack listened to all of this without comment. He was watching the mirrors more than he was watching the road, and what he was looking for was headlights. The forest trail curved and wound through the dark, and there were no headlights behind him. Not yet. He looked at the tracking bracelet. He said, "Who put that on your wrist?" Anna's answer came after a pause that was not hesitation but rather a calculation. He recognized the shape of it from interrogation training, the pause of someone deciding how much of the truth the situation required. She said, "The people who are looking for me right now." And then she said the 4 words that completed the picture in Jack Turner's mind with the efficiency of a classified briefing. She said them quietly, barely above a whisper, but in the silence of the moving truck they were as loud as anything Jack had heard in years. She said, "They are coming tonight." Atlas turned in his seat at the sound of those words. Not because he understood their content, though Jack had long suspected the dog understood more than any scientific framework would comfortably allow, but because something in the tone, something in the frequency of the fear beneath the words, was something that Atlas had been trained to respond to. He turned and looked into the back seat and then turned forward again, and the sound that came from him was the one Jack had learned to trust above almost any other signal in his life. It was not a bark. It was a deepening of his breathing, a settling into a lower, more prepared stillness, the sound of an animal that has moved from watchful to ready. And in the rearview mirror, at the edge of visibility through the falling snow, Jack saw what Atlas had already heard. A pair of headlights. In the forest. Not on any trail that was supposed to be navigable in this weather. Moving. Coming in the direction that the bracelet signal would have pointed them. Jack pressed the accelerator. He took the truck off the trail entirely, through a break in the tree line that he knew was there because he had put it there himself, clearing a secondary access route through the forest with a chainsaw the previous autumn for exactly the kind of situation where the known routes became the dangerous ones. The truck pushed through the snow with the engine grinding low and powerful, branches scraping the roof and sides, the headlights cutting erratic paths through the dark as the ground beneath the snow proved uneven and demanding. In the back seat, Anna braced herself against the door and held the injured dog steady with both arms, keeping her from being thrown around by the rough terrain. The dog endured this with extraordinary patience, the patience of an animal in pain that understands, somehow, that the current discomfort is preferable to the alternative. Jack drove hard through the trees for 8 minutes, putting 3 distinct ridges between himself and the headlights, until the forest opened onto the back approach to his cabin and he was able to cut across the open slope at speed and reach the structure from the rear, pulling the truck into the timber frame garage he had built against the back wall of the cabin and killing the engine in the dark. He sat for a moment in the silence, listening. Wind. Snow on the roof. The dogs breathing in the back seat. Atlas watching the garage door. Nothing else. No engine sounds. No voices. No crunch of footsteps in the frozen snow outside. He allowed himself one breath of something approaching relief, then opened the truck door and began moving. Inside the cabin, Jack got the fire going in under 4 minutes, dry split pine from the stack inside the door, tinder already prepared, the kind of operational efficiency that had become domestic habit over 18 months of mountain living. He got Anna onto the couch, elevated her sprained ankle, assessed the cut on her temple, it had stopped bleeding and was not deep enough to require stitching, and wrapped her in the heavy wool blanket from the storage chest. He brought the injured dog in and laid her on the rug nearest the fireplace, which was the warmest spot in the cabin. He examined her leg with the calm thoroughness of a man who had provided field medical care in conditions far more difficult than this one. The laceration was clean, caused by something sharp, possibly a fence wire or a piece of metal in the snow, and had not hit anything critical beneath. He cleaned it with the medical kit from the cabinet, applied closure strips, wrapped it with clean gauze, and spoke to the dog throughout in a quiet, steady voice that she appeared to find reassuring, letting him work without struggling or flinching beyond the occasional tightening of her muscles when he touched the sensitive area directly. Atlas lay near the door in his watchful position, his attention divided between the windows and the newcomers, the way a trained dog divides his attention in a situation he has not yet fully categorized. He was not hostile to the injured female dog. He watched her with something closer to protective concern, the instinctive response of a working dog to a fellow working dog that has been damaged. He did not approach her while Jack was treating the wound, giving the injured animal space, but when Jack finished and sat back, Atlas moved to the rug and lay down nearby with deliberate proximity, offering warmth without pressure. The injured dog turned her head and looked at him for a long moment. Some communication passed between them, wordless, complete, the language that dogs have been speaking to each other since before humans had a language for anything. Then she put her head down and closed her eyes. Jack sat across from Ana Reyes and looked at her directly in the firelight. She looked back at him with the eyes of someone who had made a decision. She reached for the backpack that Jack had retrieved from the truck, the bag that had been on the ground beside her when he found her, half buried in snow, which he had grabbed instinctively on the way back through the trees. She opened it. Inside were the things that Jack had noticed with the peripheral awareness he applied to everything but not yet examined. A sealed waterproof sleeve, a change of clothes, a compact first aid kit, a USB cable, and at the bottom of the bag, wrapped in a thermal sleeve of its own, a portable hard drive. She drew out the hard drive and held it up in the firelight. It was a standard external drive, but across its face, in small deliberate capital letters written in permanent marker, was a single word and a designation. The word was confidential. And beneath it, a file code that Jack did not recognize but that had the format of an internal government document classification. He had seen that format before, in a different context, in a different life. He looked at Anna. She told him everything. Not because she had decided to trust him completely, she was too experienced and too careful for complete trust in any single conversation, but because the situation had removed the option of partial information. Half the truth in a storm with armed people in the forest was more dangerous than the full truth, and Ana Reyes, for all the fear that was still working through her system, was an exceptionally pragmatic person. She had spent 4 years working for a private security contractor called Meridian Group, a company that presented itself publicly as a defense and logistics consulting firm with federal contracts, and that was, beneath that presentation, something considerably darker. She had been hired as a data analyst. Her background was in network security and digital forensics, and she had spent the first 2 years doing exactly the work she was hired to do, which was legitimate, if ethically gray. It was in the 3rd year that she had begun to find things in the data that she was not supposed to find. Routing patterns in Meridian's private logistics network that didn't match any of the official contract documentation. Financial transfers to shell companies in jurisdictions that specialized in being difficult to trace. Communication records between Meridian's senior leadership and a set of contacts that Anna had spent 3 months carefully identifying, working only during her personal time, using methods she had learned in her network security training to avoid leaving digital footprints. What she had found was not a peripheral irregularity or an accounting discrepancy. It was a fully operational criminal network using Meridian's legitimate logistics infrastructure, its vehicles, its routes, its federal access clearances, as cover for two separate and connected criminal enterprises. The first was a weapons pipeline running through the mountain border regions of the northwestern states, using remote forest roads and backcountry trails to move illegal arms across state lines in shipments that were routed through Meridian's official supply chain documentation and therefore largely invisible to customs and border enforcement. The second, and this was the one that had made Ana Reyes decide that she was done being careful and done being patient and done waiting for the right moment, was a human trafficking operation. Not large-scale industrial trafficking of the kind that generated international news. Something worse in its way, because it was small and precise and targeted, moving specific individuals, not anonymous victims but people who had been specifically identified, across borders and into situations that the data on her drive documented in devastating, unambiguous detail. She had spent 6 months building the evidence file. Cross-referencing, verifying, duplicating, protecting. The drive in her hand was not a rough first draft. It was a prosecutorial package. The kind that could end careers and close organizations and send people to federal prison for the rest of their functional lives. The GPS tracking bracelet on her wrist was not a law enforcement device. It had been placed there 3 days ago by a Meridian security operative who had become aware that Ana was building a case. The bracelet was their way of controlling the situation, monitoring her location while they decided what to do about the fact that one of their analysts had spent 6 months documenting their entire operation. The men in the forest tonight were not law enforcement. They were Meridian's internal security team, former military, well-equipped, operating under the understanding that their instructions this evening were to recover the drive and resolve the situation in whatever way the situation required. Ana had run from her apartment 3 nights ago when she realized the bracelet was there. She had found it by accident, reaching for a spare charging cable, and had spent 2 days trying to reach the one contact she trusted enough to give the drive to, a federal judge in Helena who had a reputation for being genuinely independent and genuinely uncorruptible. She hadn't made it. The storm and the men in the forest had found her first. Jack had been completely still throughout this account, his elbows on his knees, his eyes on Ana's face, running 2 separate cognitive processes simultaneously the way he had trained himself to do in high-stakes briefings, one processing the information, one assessing the speaker. Both processes arrived at the same conclusion. She was telling the truth. Not because she had no incentive to shape the truth toward her own interest, but because the specific details she was providing, the operational structure, the route documentation, the classification format on the drive, matched patterns he had encountered in briefings during his SEAL career with a specificity that was not replicable by invention. And because of the way she said the next thing, which came after a pause that was clearly a moment of genuine internal debate about whether to include it. She said, "There's one more thing." Jack waited. She said, "Someone inside the federal government is actively helping them. Not a peripheral contact. Someone with access to enforcement schedules, border patrol routing, federal investigation status updates. Someone who has been providing Meridian with advance warning every time a federal agency got close to looking in their direction. The drive has the documentation. The communication records. The identity." She stopped. Then said, quietly, "That's why I couldn't go to the FBI directly. And why I couldn't go through official channels. I don't know how far the protection goes. I only know it goes far enough to have kept Meridian operating for at least 3 years after the D first flagged them as a person of interest." The fire crackled in the silence. The wind pushed against the cabin walls. Jack looked at the drive in Ana's hand, then at the bracelet on her wrist, then at the window where the storm was still pressing its white face against the glass. A government insider. It changed the geometry of the situation in ways that were not comfortable to think through quickly. It meant the standard escalation paths, call the FBI, call the state police, call anyone with a badge and a radio, were potentially compromised. It meant the drive needed to reach the right hands specifically, not simply the nearest official hands. It meant the federal judge in Helena, Ana's original destination, was still the cleanest option, because federal judges operated with a degree of institutional independence from law enforcement that other officials did not. But Helena was 140 kilometers away, across mountain roads that were currently impassable in a storm, with armed men somewhere in the forest between here and the main highway. Jack looked at the bracelet one more time. He reached into the kitchen drawer and brought out a multitool. He looked at Anna. She extended her wrist without a word. He examined the clasp mechanism, tamper-evident, designed to show clear damage if cut, and then, rather than cutting it, found the electronic component housing on the underside and used the multitool's smallest flathead to carefully, precisely disable the battery circuit without breaking the external casing. The light on the bracelet went out. Whoever was tracking the signal would see it go dead at this location. They would not know if it was a technical failure, a deliberate disabling, or if she was still here and the battery had simply failed. It brought ambiguity. Ambiguity, in tactical terms, was almost as good as cover. He turned to the secondary communications terminal mounted on the wall behind the kitchen cabinet, the hardened military-grade unit he had installed when he first moved into this cabin, partly out of habit and partly out of the sense that a man who had spent 12 years in places where communications infrastructure could not be trusted should maintain his own. He connected a secure line. He thought about who to call. He thought about this for exactly 90 seconds, which was longer than he usually needed to make a decision but shorter than the gravity of the situation probably warranted. Then he made a call to a number he had not dialed in 14 months, to a man he trusted in the specific and absolute way that you trust only the people who have been in the same rooms with you on the same worst nights. He was in the middle of that call when Atlas, from his position at the door, made the sound. Not the preparatory sound of something approaching. The definitive sound of something already close. And then the injured dog on the rug lifted her head with a speed and precision that was startling in a badly injured animal, and she looked directly at the west wall of the cabin. And Jack's field instincts, which had never fully deactivated in 18 months of mountain solitude, came fully online in the space of a single heartbeat. He ended the call. He went to the window, side angle, not direct, and looked out. 3 vehicles. Not one. Not the single black SUV he had expected. 3, 2 at the tree line to the west, 1 positioned at the slope to the north, headlights off but engines running, visible in the cold by the exhaust rising in pale columns through the falling snow. 6 men, minimum, visible figures at the vehicles, with more likely holding back in the dark. They had triangulated the dead bracelet signal to this location before it went dark, and they had come in numbers that said they were not expecting a simple retrieval operation. They had come in numbers that said they had assessed their target accurately. The cabin went dark. Not a power failure. The sound that preceded the darkness was a sharp mechanical click from outside, the sound of a manual shut-off on the external power supply line, accessible from the corner of the structure. Someone knew where the external shut-off was. Someone had done their research. The cabin plunged into the orange firelight of the hearth, and every shadow in the room changed character immediately, becoming deeper, more fluid, less predictable. Jack was already moving before the last of the electric light faded. He reached beneath the kitchen counter and opened the locked case. He said to Anna, in the low clear voice of a man issuing operational instructions, "Get behind the fireplace wall. Take the drive. Take the dog." He looked at the injured dog on the rug, who was already attempting to stand, 3 legs and sheer will, pushing herself up despite the wrapped leg, the firelight catching her eyes and making them amber and bright and completely serious. He said to her, without thinking about whether it was rational to speak to a dog he had known for less than 2 hours as though she understood priorities, "Not yet. Stay with her for now." The dog looked at him. Then she turned and moved to Anna's position behind the fireplace wall, and lay down in front of Anna like a small and damaged fortification, her chin on the floor, her eyes on the room. Jack took his position at the corner of the front wall, where the angle gave him maximum sight line to both the door and the primary window without putting him in direct line of either entry point. Atlas moved to the secondary position, the corner diagonal to Jack's, covering the approaches that Jack's angle left in shadow, without a single spoken command. 12 years of shared operations had built between them a tactical language that required no words, only attention and the kind of trust that had been tested enough times in enough difficult places to be beyond question. They waited. The storm continued outside. The fire crackled. The snow pressed against the windows. And then a voice came through the door, amplified, controlled, the practiced voice of someone who had delivered this particular speech before. "We only want the drive. Give us the drive," and the woman walks away. "Nobody has to get hurt tonight." Jack said nothing. Silence was the most honest answer he could give, because what the voice was offering was not a genuine option, and both parties in this exchange understood that perfectly well. A data analyst who could build the kind of prosecutorial package that Ana Reyes had built was not the kind of problem that resolved by recovering the drive. The drive was important, but Ana herself was the real problem, because Anna's knowledge existed in her mind independent of any storage device, and the people outside this cabin were not in the business of accepting half solutions. He heard the voice confer briefly with someone else, too low to make out words. Then the west window exploded inward. The entry came simultaneously at 2 points, window and door, a professional 2-point breach that Jack had been anticipating since the moment the power went out, which was why he was not at either point when it happened. He was at the corner, and the geometry of the corner meant that both entry vectors converged toward the center of the room, away from him, and he was able to manage the situation in the darkness with the training and the field intelligence of a man who had spent more hours of his adult life operating in hostile darkness than in comfortable light. Atlas dealt with the window entry, fast, total, entirely professional, and the sound that resulted was brief and conclusive. Jack dealt with the door entry with equal efficiency, and the man who came through it found himself on the floor with his weapon secured and his wrists zip-tied before his eyes had fully adjusted to the firelight. 2 down. Jack heard footsteps outside, more than 2 remaining, pulling back toward the vehicles, regrouping. He heard the leader's voice, tighter now, less controlled. He heard the sound of something being removed from a vehicle. He moved to the window and identified the new threat immediately, a portable arc light, battery-powered, the kind used in search operations, being set up at the tree line. They were going to flood the cabin with light, trying to neutralize the darkness advantage. Jack had approximately 4 to 5 seconds before it activated. He used those 4 to 5 seconds to move Anna and both dogs to the back room, the windowless storeroom at the rear of the cabin that he had reinforced with a steel panel interior wall on the original timber framing. He had built that reinforcement 6 months ago, during one of the nights when the silence in the cabin had been loud enough that he had needed to do something physical, something constructive, something that turned the nervous energy into an object that would last. He had not known, building it, what he was building it for. He knew now. He got Anna inside, with both dogs, with the drive, with the secondary comms unit that he unplugged from the wall and brought with him on a long cable, trailing back to its port. He closed the steel-reinforced door. He went back to the main room. The arc light activated outside, flooding the cabin with cold white brilliance through the broken window, and Jack, already adjusted, already repositioned, already working with the new information rather than against it, managed the next phase of the confrontation with the methodical, controlled efficiency of a man who was not winning on the basis of superior numbers but on the basis of superior knowledge of the terrain he was standing on. The attackers were professional and capable and motivated, and there were 4 of them remaining outside in varying positions. Jack was one man in a structure he had built and reinforced and memorized. He was one man who had spent 12 years being put in places where the professional calculus favored the other side and was expected to function anyway. The confrontation that followed lasted 11 minutes, during which the cabin sustained damage to 2 windows, the front door, and a section of the north wall, and during which Jack Turner sustained a cut to his left forearm from broken glass and a bruise along his right ribs from a collision with the kitchen counter in the dark. None of these things changed the outcome. What changed the outcome was Nova. The injured dog, the grey and white German shepherd who had spent 3 hours in a blizzard guarding an unconscious woman on a broken leg, who had then endured truck travel and fire treatment and hiding in a storeroom with the patience of an animal that had long since exceeded any reasonable expectation of endurance, made her own decision about the moment that required her intervention. The back storeroom door was not locked from the inside. It had a handle. And the injured dog, on 3 functional legs and 1 carefully wrapped one, had apparently spent the time in the storeroom working out that handles were not beyond her ability to manage. The door came open. And Nova came out of it at a pace that should not have been possible for a dog with her injury, moving toward the figure who had gotten through the north wall breach and was advancing toward the storeroom door from the other side, the side that had Anna and Atlas and the drive in it. She hit him with everything she had. Not with the trained precision of a working military dog, she had not had that training. With the raw, total commitment of a dog who had decided, at some point in the last 12 hours, that this woman and these people were hers to protect, and that the pain in her leg was a much smaller fact than that. The figure went down with a shout. Jack was there a second later, and the situation resolved. But when Jack reached down to check on Nova, finding her lying on her side, the wrapped leg held up, the wound gauze dark where the exertion had reopened it, the expression on the dog's face was not pain and it was not fear. It was the expression of an animal that has done exactly what it decided to do and is entirely at peace with the consequences. The leader was the last one unaccounted for. Jack heard him outside, heard the sound of running footsteps in the snow heading west toward the tree line, and made the calculation that running was, from the leader's perspective, the only remaining option that made any sense. He had 2 men secured inside the cabin. He had 2 more down at the perimeter. His mission had failed. The drive was still in the cabin. The woman was still in the cabin. And something in the building had gone wrong in a way that his briefing had apparently not adequately prepared him for. He ran. Into the forest. Into the blizzard. And for a moment, standing in the broken doorway of his cabin with the cold pouring in around him and Atlas at his side and the fire still burning behind him, Jack Turner watched the darkness where the leader had disappeared and made the choice that civilians make and operatives sometimes struggle with. He let him go. Not because the man deserved the mercy of it, but because Anna and Nova were inside and needed him more than the forest needed him right now. He went back inside. He went to Nova first. He rewrapped the leg, cleaned the reopened wound, spoke to her throughout in the same quiet steady voice he had used the first time. She allowed all of this with her chin on the floor and her eyes on the storeroom door where Anna was. He got Anna out of the storeroom. She looked at Nova, at the dark gauze, at the extraordinary animal lying on the rug, and something in her face did a thing that faces do when a person encounters loyalty at a scale they were not prepared for. She sat on the floor beside the dog and put her hand on Nova's side and for a moment did not speak. Then she looked at Jack and said, "Will she be all right?" And Jack looked at the dog who had walked 3 hours through a Montana blizzard on a broken leg to stand guard over a stranger, who had come out of a locked storeroom to defend someone she had known for less than 4 hours, and said, with a certainty that surprised him slightly in its completeness, "Yes. She will." He went to the comms unit. The call he had made earlier, the truncated call to the man he trusted, had been enough. He had given a location, a situation designation, and 2 words that in their shared operational vocabulary meant federal emergency evidence and hostile engagement. The man on the other end had known what to do with those words. And what he had done with them had set in motion the kind of official response that moves quickly when the right people hear the right words. Jack connected the encrypted drive to the comms unit through Anna's USB cable, and Anna transferred the files through the secure line in 7 minutes and 40 seconds, the longest 7 minutes and 40 seconds Jack had experienced since a night in a valley in Afghanistan that he did not allow himself to think about in detail. When the transfer completed, Anna let out a breath and closed her eyes, and when she opened them again something had shifted behind them. The weight that had been there, not just tonight's weight but the weight of 6 months of building a case alone, of carrying evidence that could destroy people who had the resources to destroy her first, was still present, but it was no longer hers alone to carry. She had handed it over to whatever came next. What came next arrived 11 minutes later, the sound of rotors above the cabin, barely audible through the storm at first, then unmistakably clear as they drew closer. The lights came through the windows before the sound was fully intelligible, white and blue and red strobing through the snow, the lights of not 1 helicopter but 2, and in the distance the moving yellow beams of ground vehicles on the main road. Jack went to the porch and looked up. Federal emergency response. Moving fast, moving with the kind of coordinated precision that only gets mobilized when someone high enough up the chain of command decides that the next few hours are going to matter for a long time afterward. The call Jack had made 18 months ago, to the man he still trusted with the specific things that specific trust is built for, had reached the right people. And the evidence on the drive, now transmitted to a secure federal server, had given those people everything they needed to move. The leader of the team that had come to the cabin was found the following morning, 3 kilometers into the forest, hypothermic and disoriented, following a trail that had led him in a circle through the dark. He was taken into federal custody without incident, too cold and too exhausted to offer anything but compliance. The other men were already in custody, having been secured in the cabin and transferred to federal agents who arrived with the helicopter team. Their weapons, their vehicles, and their communications equipment were catalogued and seized as evidence, and within 48 hours the devices had been forensically examined and had provided a communication trail that connected Meridian Group's internal security team directly to the senior leadership who had authorized the operation against Ana Reyes. The investigation moved with the speed that the quality of Ana's evidence made possible. She had spent 6 months building a case that was, in the assessment of the federal prosecutors who reviewed it in the days following her rescue, one of the most comprehensively documented instances of corporate criminal organization they had encountered in years. The human trafficking routes were the priority. Federal resources were immediately directed to the specific geographic and logistical points that Ana's documentation identified, and within 3 weeks the operation had produced the first arrests, the first seizures, and the first evidence of the live network that had been running through Meridian's logistics infrastructure. The weapons pipeline was addressed in parallel, a secondary investigation that drew additional federal agencies into a case that was growing, with each layer of evidence examined, into something considerably larger than any single agency had anticipated. The government insider, the official whose name was in Ana's documentation, whose communication records with Meridian's leadership had been logged and verified and cross-referenced over months of meticulous work, was identified and suspended within 72 hours of the evidence being received. The suspension came before an arrest, because the case against this particular individual required a level of care and precision that would withstand the legal scrutiny that came with prosecuting a federal official. That scrutiny came. The arrest followed 41 days after the night in the Montana blizzard, in a manner that generated a federal indictment and a news cycle that ran for weeks. The name was one that many people recognized. The fact that it was connected to what it was connected to was one that no one who heard it was prepared for. Ana Reyes, watching the news coverage from the small hotel in Helena where she was staying during the initial phase of the investigation, turned off the television after 10 minutes and sat in the quiet room and thought about 6 months of work and a mountain road in January and a dog who had refused to leave her in the snow. She called Jack the next morning. They had spoken several times in the days since the cabin, brief, practical conversations about evidence logistics and official statements and the travel requirements of the investigation process. This call was longer. She asked about Nova. Jack told her that Nova was healing. He said it in a tone that communicated not just medical progress but something else, the particular quality of presence that a dog who has done something extraordinary brings into a space, a quality that was distinct from Atlas's steady professional calm and from Nova's own exhausted recovery and that had nonetheless become, in the days since the storm, something that Jack Turner's cabin felt more complete for containing. He had taken Nova to the veterinarian in Millhaven on the second day, a 6-hour round trip through roads that were clear now that the storm had passed, and the vet had examined the wound, redressed it properly, provided antibiotics and pain management, and told Jack that the dog would recover fully. The leg would heal. There would be a scar. But she would run again. Jack had looked at the vet for a moment after she said that, and then had looked at Nova, who was looking up at him from the examination table with the amber eyes that had been looking at him from various positions and distances since the moment on the road when she had appeared in his headlights. He thought about what it took to do what she had done. What quality of heart, what depth of commitment, what category of courage that operated entirely without self-interest or calculation. He thought that the scar on her leg was not the kind of mark that diminished something. It was the other kind. He named her that day. He had been thinking of names since the night she came in from the storm, running through possibilities the way you run through possibilities for something that matters, discarding the ones that didn't fit and waiting for the one that did. The veterinarian had asked, filling out the intake form, and Jack had paused for a moment and looked at the dog and thought about a mountain road in a blizzard and a tiny limping shape in his headlights that had refused to give up. He said, "Nova." The vet wrote it down. Atlas, from his position beside the examination table, turned and looked at Nova with a calm reassessing gaze, the look of a dog acknowledging a new social reality, and then looked away in the direction of the window, apparently satisfied. Nova turned her head and looked at Jack. He didn't know with certainty what dogs understood about names. But something in the way she held his gaze for those 3 seconds suggested that she understood enough. The story broke nationally 5 weeks after the blizzard. A journalist in Helena, working from the public record of the federal indictments and the environmental protection filings and the accounts of the officials involved, pieced together a narrative that captured, in the way that the best journalism captures, not just the facts of what had happened but the shape of it, the way that a single night on a remote mountain road had connected to something much larger than itself, and how the connection had been made possible by the specific and unrepeatable combination of a retired Navy SEAL who drove empty roads at night and an injured dog who refused to leave someone alone in the snow. The story was read widely. It generated the kind of response that stories about loyalty and courage generate, which is a response that goes beyond the usual categories of news interest and touches something that people carry around regardless of where they live or what they believe about the world. A television crew came to Millhaven. Jack declined to be interviewed. He said no with the same complete and final quality with which he said everything, not rudely, but absolutely, in a way that left no room for negotiation or appeal. He was not a story. What had happened in the blizzard was a story, but he was not it, and he did not want to perform himself for a camera in the way that cameras required. Anna spoke to the journalists, briefly and carefully, saying what needed to be said about the evidence and the investigation and what it meant for the people who had been affected by Meridian's operation, careful language, legally reviewed, specific where it needed to be specific and general where it needed to be general. She was good at it. She had always been good at constructing precise communication under pressure. But one question, asked at the edge of a press gathering by a reporter who had driven 6 hours from Billings specifically for it, was a question that neither Anna nor the official representatives could answer as well as the one person who could. The reporter had gone to the hardware store in Millhaven on a long shot, having heard from a local that Jack Turner occasionally appeared there on weekday mornings, and she had been right. She found him at the truck, Nova in the back and Atlas in the cab, and she asked her question before he had time to decide not to answer it. She asked, "Why do you think the dog trusted you? Out of everyone who could have come along that road, why did she pick you?" Jack Turner looked at the truck bed, where Nova was sitting with her nose lifted to the cold morning air and her ears rotating toward the sounds of the town around her. Her leg was healed enough now that she moved freely, with only the occasional slight favoring that the vet had said would diminish further over the next few weeks. She looked like a dog who had decided that the world was a manageable place and that her position in it, here, in this truck, with these people, was exactly where she was supposed to be. Jack looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Atlas through the cab window, who was watching him with the focused amber gaze of a dog who had been watching him for 5 years and knew every version of him. Then Jack looked at the reporter and gave the only answer that seemed to match the size of what he had been asked. "Loyalty doesn't ask who deserves saving," he said. "It just saves." The reporter wrote that down. She used it as the last line of the story she published, a story that found its way into homes and offices and phones in 43 countries and was translated into 17 languages and shared in the particular way that things are shared when they remind people of something they believe about the world that they sometimes forget. The story's central facts were extraordinary: the evidence, the operation, the arrests, the scope of what Ana Reyes had documented and survived. But the thing that people carried with them after reading it was not the criminal case or the federal investigation or the political reverberations of the insider's identity. It was the image of a dog in a blizzard, injured and alone, who had decided that loyalty was not conditional on capability or circumstance or the cold. Who had stood in the road at -14 degrees and barked until someone came. Who had done everything she could and then, when a stranger arrived, had done more. In the months that followed, Jack Turner's cabin in the Montana mountains was still remote and still quiet and still the kind of place that people who needed the world to be a certain size came to live. But it was different from before. Not dramatically different. Not the kind of different that you could photograph or explain easily to someone who had not been in the cabin before and after. It was the kind of different that accumulates when a space that has been holding one kind of silence begins to hold a different kind. The silence of a man who has come to a mountain to be finished with things, and the silence of a man who has discovered, in the middle of a blizzard on a frozen road, that he is not finished, that there is something still in progress, something that a limping dog and a woman with a hard drive and a night that should have gone differently had somehow set in motion. The difference between those two silences is not loud. But it is real. Atlas slept in his usual position by the door. Nova slept near the fire, in the spot that had been hers since the night she came in from the storm, her scarred legs stretched out in the warmth. They moved through the cabin days with the easy familiarity of two animals who have negotiated their territory and their affection with the practical directness that only dogs manage, and the cabin was fuller for both of them in a way that Jack had stopped trying to quantify and simply accepted as true. Anna Reyes drove up from Helena on weekends when the investigation's demands allowed it, and they were frequent enough to be a pattern, and the pattern was frequent enough to be something else, and the something else was in no particular hurry to be named. She always brought something for Atlas, and something for Nova, and Nova always accepted her offering first, a priority that Anna had stopped commenting on but never stopped noticing with a quiet, private expression that was not entirely something you could call anything other than gratitude. On a February morning, 3 months after the blizzard, Jack was sitting on the cabin porch with coffee and Nova at his feet when the dog lifted her head and turned it toward the forest, not the alert movement of a threat response, but the soft, curious orientation of an animal that has heard something interesting in the middle distance. He followed her gaze. The trees were still and white and ordinary. Whatever she had heard, he couldn't hear it. He watched her for a moment, this dog who had walked through the worst the mountain could offer, who had stayed when staying was the only thing she had left to give, and felt something that he had not felt for a long time. Something that did not have a precise military designation. Something that was simply the sensation of being exactly where you are supposed to be, in a moment that is exactly what it is, without the weight of the past or the calculation of the future pulling at it from both sides. He put his hand on Nova's head. She leaned into it slightly, her eyes still on the forest, her scarred legs stretched warm in the February sun. The mountain was quiet. The storm was long gone. And somewhere beneath the snow that still covered the high peaks, spring was already building toward its arrival, slow and certain and inevitable, the way that all the truest things are. And on the coldest night of that winter, on a mountain road in Montana where the storm had buried everything in white and the temperature had dropped below the mercy of ordinary cold, a wounded dog had carried a truth that refused to be buried. Not because she was trained to. Not because she was told to. But because the thing she was protecting was worth everything she had, and she had given everything she had, and the truth of that, simple and complete as a single clear note in an empty room, was the kind of thing that the world, when it hears it, does not easily forget.